record. Great. So we're now recording. And I thought we'd start with a nigun, a way of just sort of centering ourselves and bringing ourselves to this new place of music and learning. Ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba, ya ba ba ba, ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ya ba ba ba, ya ba 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 ba. Oh ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ya ba bim bam. Ya ba ba, ya ba ba ba, ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ya ba ba ba, ya ba 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 ba. Oh ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba, ya ba ba ba, ya ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam. Ya ba ba ba, ya ba 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 ba. So it's good to see everyone this morning, and good to, well, literally see some of you and see others' names and pictures. Perfectly fine to have your camera off this morning. So many of you were on last Sunday, but if you were not on last Sunday, not to worry. You will still get much out of today's class, even without last week. But just to sort of recap a little, part one of this lesson focused on how music has changed over the past 60 years and three of the major forces that influence that change. We talked about the introduction of the folk and rock tradition on Jewish music, specifically looking at Debbie Friedman and the influence of summer camps. We talked about the impact of the 1967 Six-Day War on the American Jewish community, leading to expanded ties and interactions with Israel. And we also talked about the role of technology in the creation and distribution of music. So today we're going to look, we're going to take that as our springboard moving forward and looking at three case studies of individuals, two individuals, and the third is actually a group, whose music takes up this legacy of change, and really stand at the forefront of a very diverse Jewish American music scene. We will look at the lives and musical contributions of composer Gerald Cohen, singer and songwriter Basia Schechter, and the leaders of Nava Tehillah. Through them, we'll look at three very different approaches to making new Jewish music. We will look at the influence they've had on American Jewish music innovation through three different streams, larger streams in Jewish music. One is Western art music, and we'll talk a little bit about what I mean when I say that. One is world music, and the third is through spirituality and looking at the Jewish renewal movement. While each of these is very different, we'll also find, I think, a lot of commonalities: the role of Jewish education and the role of music education, the innovation of Judaism, in the innovation of Jewish music, the importance of text and text study, and how text for all of these three cases really is the root of their inspiration. And then, of course, the exploration of one's own spirituality. So we're going to look today at, at these three people, and maybe you even can think of performers or composers, and if you feel like putting them in the chat, people that you find particularly inspiring or innovative. We probably all have different composers or songwriters or musicians for whom we find a deep connection to their music. And perhaps it is through innovation, and perhaps it is through their instrumentation or how they write or their evolution and their composition. But that might be just something to think about, sort of thinking about those that really speak to you when really looking at the different ways that these composers write and come to their music. So some things to think about as we're thinking about all of these different composers. What is the importance of the sounds around us during formative periods of our lives? When we first experience music, how does that influence composers and songwriters and singers and musicians? What is the role of Jewish education? How does their own Jewish upbringing influence their writing? And how does the desire to explore one's own spirituality and one's own connection to God lead to musical innovation and creativity? So I'm gonna share my screen just because sometimes it's fun to have something to look at besides me. And great, you should be seeing a slide that says, what is art music? Can I just get thumbs up if that's what you're seeing on your screen? Great, okay. Thank you. I saw Deanne's thumb first, but I'm assuming everyone else is seeing it as well. So what is art music? I'm going to talk a little bit about what is art music when we use that term. Art music has been a part of the Jewish world since the time of Salomon Rossi. This particular image you see is from the cover of a collection that Salomon Rossi wrote. You may be able to tell by his name, Salomone Rossi, that he was Italian. He was from the court of Mantua, and he is credited as being the first composer of art music in the for Jewish worship. So when I say art music, what do I mean? I think it's what many of us think of as classical music. And the reason I use the term art music and not classical music is that classical technically refers to a very specific period of time, from the late 18th century into the early 19th century. We talk about specifically the period of classical music. We're talking about composers such as Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Now, in colloquial circles, classical has become a term that many people use to describe all orchestral music or all chamber music or opera. We call that genre classical music, but specifically within classical music, we have different periods. We have Renaissance music, we have Baroque, classical, romantic, and contemporary. So I use the term art music in really describing music that's written specifically in that artistic style, contrasting with things like pop music or world ethnic music. And we're going to talk about art music specifically when we're talking about our first composer, and that is Gerald Cohen. By the way, he is the man sitting at the piano in this picture, and we'll actually see a video of him performing, I think, this very piece in just a little bit. So when we think of art music, when we think of what you might call classical music, when do we experience that in our Jewish lives now? You can unmute yourself if you have some thoughts or put it in the chat. When do we experience art music in Jewish life now? In your Jewish life or in the life of the synagogue? What are some examples that you might think of? You can raise your hand also if you want to share. Great. So Pam says Kol Nidre. Harriet says high holidays. Great. Exactly. Those are both examples of things that, yes, on the holidays, we certainly find that level of music, that style of music that one might call more classical, more serious, more art music. The theme of the holidays, of course, often is proclaiming God's majesty. And so we really heighten the music to a different level to really get that feeling. High Holidays is a great example, but even things like the Shema we sing every week really comes from a time of artistic style. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. This is a style doesn't sound like Debbie Friedman, doesn't sound Israeli, doesn't sound like a lot of the other music we hear, we find that that music even creeps in on Shabbat. But I love, Harriet mentioned some composers we hear. Max Janowski. Max Janowski wrote the famous Avinu Malkeinu Shema Kolenu, or Lewandowski. Very grand music for often forces beyond a single cantor, with choir, with organ, with piano, with strings, with musicians. So what are you listening for when you listen for art music? What distinguishes it from other genres? I think several things. One is instrumentation. I think you'll hear more, again, new instrumentation that might more closely resemble that you might hear in a concert hall or a symphony hall. Hearing organ or piano, strings. We don't think of art music as being accompanied by a rock band or by a folk guitarist. And so it's just, again, just to help define that, what really sets that apart. And when we think of cantorial music, especially the Reform movement, as we touched on last time, early Reform music was very much trying to resemble music of their Christian neighbors. And so things like hymns were very popular. Some of you may even have grown up with the Union hymnal. Did any of you grow up singing out of the Union hymnal? Yeah, I'm seeing a few hands. That was in the early Reform. There was a hymnal, just like you might find in a church, full of 4-part hymns that were sung in the synagogue. Things like All the World or God is in His Holy Temple. Those may be tunes that I'm seeing some light bulbs going off that some of you may have remembered from your childhood, especially if you grew up in the Reform movement. Those would have been melodies that we would hear. So let's talk a little bit about Gerald Cohen. Again, Gerald Cohen is just one example, but I would say sort of one of the really leading writers of art music today. Composer Gerald Cohen has been praised for his linguistic fluidity and melodic gift, creating music that reveals a very personal modernism that offers great emotional rewards. His deeply affecting compositions have been recognized with numerous awards and critical accolades. He is the composer of much synagogue music, but also music outside the synagogue. Perhaps his most lauded work was an opera called Steal a Pencil for Me, based on a true concentration camp love story. I think you can find examples of it on YouTube, so I encourage you to check that out. Again, it's called Steal a Pencil for Me. It was performed at Opera Colorado and at Fort Worth Opera as well. Now, interestingly, Gerald Cohen is not only a composer, but also a synagogue cantor. And we'll talk a little bit about that, how that influences his writing. Probably his best known work, and you've heard this at Temple Isaiah before, is his setting of Psalm 23, and we'll listen to it in a little bit. This has probably the piece that has gone most wide in his popularity, performed at synagogues and churches, even performed at the Vatican. He also has written instrumental music, and we'll look a little bit at his instrumental music as well in just a little bit. His formal music training, again, just to give you a little bit of a back. Actually, let's listen to a little bit of his music first, and then I will share a little bit more about him, just to give you a little bit of flavor. Okay. So certain things, well, just to point out a couple things, the choir that you heard is called the Hazamir Chorale, and that is actually a collected choir of teens from all over the United States and Israel who all learn their music independently and then come together as one choir. I'm pretty sure that was Avery Fisher Hall in New York, but some of you maybe also recognized it as well. What were the characteristics that sort of set that as art music, as opposed to maybe what you might call or think of as other synagogue music? One of the questions Virginia Pizer asked, what was that time signature? That was a great question. It shifted a lot. It started, let me think for a second. It starts in 10/4 time. That is to say 10 beats to a bar. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. But it shifts around a lot. So that's one thing, right? It was not always so easy necessarily to tap our toe to it and find where the beat was. It was very rhythmic, as Terry mentioned. A lot of what we call syncopation, things where the accents appear in places that you don't always expect. The text, Pithuli Sharet Tzedek, that comes from the Psalms, we hear that on the high holidays, but also in Hallel, whenever we have a festival. That is, open the gates of justice to me, one of the more famous Psalms. And I think it's also a good thing to point out who was singing. They were teens, they were young people, and that's something that Gerald Cohen works with a lot. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor of his music, a little bit more. We'll hear a little bit more of his music in just a little bit, but let me tell you a little bit about his background, because I think, again, to understand what his upbringing was like will give you a little bit of understanding of how he arrived at this point in his writing. He was born in 1960 in New York. He began his formal musical training at the piano at age 7. And he notes, a lot of this comes, by the way, from an interview with him. He notes that he was crazy about classical music from the age of 2 or 3. And shortly after he began piano at 7, he started writing music. And he looks back at that first piece and even feels that it seemed to have what he called a Jewish feeling about it, although he is unsure as why that came through at such an early age. His childhood was filled with piano study, with composition, and lots of going to concerts and studying scores. By the age of 12 years old, he had written a Vishamru for chorus, flute, and piano. So clearly, even early on, he was already wanting to combine the Jewish parts of his life with the musical parts of his life. He attended synagogue from an early age. His cantor was Jack Mendelson. Some of you may be familiar with him. Perhaps the great documentary that we showed at Temple, but perhaps some of you have seen it otherwise, called A Cantor's Tale, about his life. One of the great cantors, traditional cantors of our time. And so that was the synagogue he grew up with, hearing amazing, amazing cantorial music. And because he was so musical, he led much more of his bar mitzvah service than the average student did. He went on to study music at Yale, where he did work in piano and composition. While there, he began to sing in a concert choir. Up until then, he had not been a singer, though he is now a cantor. But that was a real formative experience in his deep love of choral music. And he learned how to lead high holiday services. At that point, Jack Mendelson had moved on to another synagogue, and he, Gerald Cohen, was called upon at his own synagogue to lead services. When he came home from college, he started taking voice lessons for the first time. And though he had thought of himself really mainly as a pianist or composer, he started to really imagine that perhaps he was a singer as well. He received his first commission, a choral piece for the Connecticut Hebrew Chorale, and also had a job, interestingly, as a music specialist at a nursing home, giving him his first deep experience of seeing how the power of music could really be a healing art form. He continued to study privately with Jack Mendelson, and was initially hired for high holidays and then assumed a position as a year-round cantor. He now serves at Share Tikva in Scarsdale, New York, where he has been for 32 years. It is a part-time position, which he has insisted on, as he does want to focus continuing on composing and teaching as well. So when you think about one's influences on external influences on one's creative output, he is a great example. Here is somebody with a strong classical music training. He says that when he thinks of himself as a composer, there are so many composers that influence him, but none of them are Jewish composers. He cites Beethoven, Mahler, Schubert, Britten, Copland, Brahms, Verdi, Mendelssohn, Bartók as being major influences. And yet what he puts out is almost exclusively Jewish music. When asked about particular music that influenced him, he talks about works like Bernstein's Chichester Psalms, which some of you may be familiar with. We've performed that a couple times at Temple Isaiah, and some of you have had the honor of singing that as well. A work for whom the music itself perhaps does not ring of Jewish sounds like we might hear in the synagogue, but when a work is composed entirely in Hebrew, and the composer is Leonard Bernstein, one can certainly understand and hear those Jewish influences. Let's listen to another sample of his music, and this is his Adonai Ro'i, this setting of Psalm 23. I have the words on the screen here, though they probably are familiar to you. This is one translation, a translation he has used for Psalm 23. Okay. Oops. Just a moment. Okay, let me try this again. Okay. I'd love to hear a little bit, what do you hear when you hear that? Stylistically, or beautiful, yes, it is beautiful. It is beautiful. How does it speak to you in terms of Jewish music? It's sort of the age-old, I've talked about in other classes I've taught before, what is Jewish music? If the person writing it is Jewish, or perfect for the text. So music that really has that very almost pastoral feel to it. The key, yeah, absolutely. Other things you might hear or how it might speak to you. Nice. Just seeing some of the comments in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Blessing.
I have to say it because I don't know how to write it. The layering of the tones, the waves of the intersection of the different, the bass, tenor, alto, I could hear each one and how they blended to create this, beautiful, I don't know, it's even hard to express, but it was so amazing. Like every part of my brain was lit up. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, Steve, exactly, right? It's not sing-along music, right? And that's part of what makes that art music. It's formally presented. It provides within a synagogue. Now, you could hear this in a concert hall, right? You might go to a concert and hear something like this. And it would be a beautiful concert. And so when we bring sort of that sound, those concert sounds into the synagogue, yeah, there's a certain formality to it, absolutely. And, but hopefully, I think also can bring a heightened sense of spirituality. We talked about last time the contrast between congregational singing and sometimes praying with our ears. That is to say, to have a prayerful moment, an awe-inspiring moment. Beautiful, thanks, Herb. To bring our own sense of spirituality to a different place. Yeah, JJ.
I also felt that it was very transitional, at least for me. It didn't have quite the formality and majesty that we might hear at the high holidays from some of the more traditional composers, but obviously it isn't folk music, but it felt like a transition between the two.
I like that, right? The melody is something that you could find yourself, as Steve said, it's not something you would sing along with, but it is a melody that might stay with you. And that is, I think the gift of a great composer, right? That even though it can have that sort of seriousness and that sort of formality, that it's still a melody that stays with us. It doesn't feel, I like that idea of transitional, somewhere between the melodic sounds of something that's participatory with the formality or the sophistication, let's use that word, that we hear. Thank you for sharing that. Gerald Cohen writes that so much of what he writes is really influenced by the text, that he starts with text always, that he's not always just starting with a melody and then trying to figure out a text to put on top of it, but rather starting with a text. He says a huge part, of course, is choosing a text. If he's going through many possible ideas and discussing it, much of his work now are commissions. So he's working with people to collaborate. He said he finds these days that he is drawn to texts that are both deeply Jewish and at the same time deeply universal. Very often, one particular phrase in the text calls out a particular musical response, and then the piece gets built from that. He says writing congregational tunes is quite different for him. For that, he is thinking of the fact that he wants a new melody for a certain text for his congregation some particular week. And then he lets the text get into him, he says, until a melody kind of pops out. That is the wonderful thing about writing music for a congregation. You can see almost instantly if it works. When we perform art music, we don't always know necessarily what everyone's feeling, but often if you're going to lead a new congregational piece, I know that as a cantor, I can tell pretty much maybe within the first 8 bars, is this one catching on or not so much? To see the expression on people's faces, to see how they're moving, to see how they're responding. And I think, as he says, that is a big part. He says, I can usually feel whether a melody will work after singing it with the congregation a few times. Yes, I like that, Steve. Steve says it's music which doesn't directly appeal to our emotions like popular music does. You know, sort of like we think of Debbie Friedman, we might think of that as music that really touches our heartstrings, but really is more complex and intellectual. I like that. Very, very good. So I want to share another example of his music with you before we move on to our next group, and that is a piece. Well, I'll introduce it first to you as an instrumental piece, as he has arranged it as such. So let me share this music with you.
This unforgettable vacation memory. From
one moment, please.
This unforgettable vacation memory.
Okay. So I'm going to pause it right there. You can tell he loves rhythm, right? And even, you know, there's always something interesting going on rhythmically. Yeah, Marianne, did you want to share something? You just have to unmute.
I just wanted to say that it sounds like he was listening to Leonard Bernstein when he composed that, with the intricate changes and the starting with the flute solo in the beginning. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that. I love that. Definitely. I hear it too. Definitely a lot of those Bernstein-esque rhythms. And you even hear with the clarinets, you know, a little klezmer feel, right? An interesting choice of instrumentation. Yeah, JJ.
Well, in addition to Bernstein, I heard this like crazy mix of how Rafe Vaughan Williams and also Benny Goodman used instrumentation.
Yeah, I love that. Right, we hear that clarinet. We might always think of Benny Goodman a little bit.
Exactly.
Let me play you a little bit of the original source of this piece. So this was actually an arrangement of his own composition. That again, some might feel feels kind of rhythmic, a little Bernstein-esque, a little jazzy. Definitely has a little bit of a jazzy feel. But when we hear it with text, we might hear something a little bit different. See if you can pick up what text this is. It is a text that is familiar to every single person on this call. You just have not heard it quite sound like this. Let me play you a little example.
My name is Shannon Klingman, and I'm a baking.
So I'm assuming you picked up a little bit on the text. It's a setting of Dayenu, probably not the one you sang around your Seder table, but that same setting that he then later arranged for 2 clarinets and piano. So just interesting to hear how, when we hear it with text, when we hear it with Hebrew text, when we hear it with Jewish text that's familiar, it brings a different flavor to it, I think. And it's just interesting to see how a composer can sort of mutate that and move from one mode to another. We're going to transition now to our next musicians, and that is the Jewish community of Nava Tehillah. Now, some of you may remember that Nava Tehillah was at Temple Isaiah, maybe 3 years ago. You'll remember that we prayed with them in our social hall in the round, and we'll talk a little bit about that because that's sort of one of their unique trademarks. So let me share my slides with you. Okay. Okay. So before we talk about Nava Tehillah, let's talk a little bit about Jewish renewal. That is a term that may be familiar to some of you, but let's talk a little bit about what that is. So here you see the organization Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. This is sort of one might say the Jewish renewal version of the URJ. The Union of Reform Judaism is to reform Judaism. Aleph is for Jewish renewal. I'm going to share with you a little bit about what they write about what is Jewish renewal. They say, we combine the socially progressive values of egalitarianism with the joy of Hasidism, the informed do-it-yourself spirit of the Havurah movement, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries of tradition. That sentence alone has a lot packed in there. We're talking about liberal egalitarianism, and at the same time, the joy and teachings of the Hasidic Jews. Do-it-yourself spirit of Havurah movement, creating and doing new things, at the same time accessing, as they write, the wisdom of centuries of tradition. We value deep ecumenism. In Hillel's words, we learn from every person and every spiritual tradition. We create innovative, accessible, and welcoming prayer experiences. We shape halakha, Jewish law, into a living way of walking in the world, and we seek to deepen the ongoing, joyful, and fundamental connection with a God who connects us all, which is at the heart of Jewish practice. They say Jewish renewal is an attitude, not a denomination. Again, Jewish renewal is an attitude, not a denomination, and offers tools to all branches of Judaism. Renewal seeks to balance forward thinking with backward compatibility. We know we can't drive if we're only looking in the rearview mirror, but neither can we move forward if we don't know where we've been. So again, it's less a theology or a philosophy as it is a practice and a way of accessing one's own Judaism. But it's important to have that foundation to understand really where Nava Tehillah is coming from. So here you'll see in this picture is a picture of Nava Tehillah. This is praying in Israel. You'll see that they are praying in the round, which is how we experience them at Temple Isaiah. The leaders you will see are in the innermost circle. So they are actually facing inward, so different than what we are used to in modern Jewish life in the United States. Depending on your practice, you can see that they are in the middle. In Reform Judaism, usually the leaders are facing the congregation. And of course, in Orthodox Judaism, they're usually facing away from the congregation, as you do see sometimes within our community as well, that we sometimes turn to face the ark, praying in the same direction as the congregation. So let me tell you a little bit about Nava Tehillah, and then we'll listen to some of their music. Nava Tehillah is a Jerusalem-based NGO for Jewish renewal. One of their main focuses is creating musical and engaging prayer spaces for people to come as they are. Nava Tehillah's musical spiritual leaders generate new prayer modalities, compose new music for prayer, and train Jewish leaders, including rabbis, cantors, and students in the art of musical and innovative prayer leading. Nava Tehillah leaders travel to Reform and conservative communities in Israel and the US to share ideas that have proven so successful in drawing in not only non-affiliated Jews, but also speaking to long-term members of these communities. Their prayers are egalitarian and inclusive, welcoming people of other religions and spiritual but not religious people who want to pray and sing with them. They say, our prayer is experiential because we are constantly seeking ways of connecting to the living God in each and every moment. They meet for Kabbalat Shabbat once a month, and as well as holidays. To tell you a little bit about the three main leaders of Nava Tehillah, Daphna Rosenberg, who's on the left. Daphna is a singer and guitarist and one of the main prayer leaders at Nava Tehillah. She composes new music and also creates new life cycle ceremonies. Yoel Sykes, who is on the right, is also a composer. And in the middle is Ruth Gon-Kagan. Ruth is the rabbi of the community, a rabbi and a teacher of Chassidut, that is to say Hasidic teachings, and Kabbalah. She is the spiritual leader of Nava Tehillah and the creator of the style. And we'll talk a little bit about what makes their style unique. But let's actually watch a little bit of Nava Tehillah in action. The video I'm going to show you is a sample from Shabbat in Jerusalem. Some of you, if you've been in, I don't know when it finally was finished, maybe in the last 10 years, what was the old train station in Jerusalem has been converted into a pedestrian mall and community area. And they celebrate Shabbat there every Friday with different prayer leaders. So this is an example of Nava Tehillah leading in Jerusalem. Great. Andy Charlotte had a question about Shlomo Carlebach. We'll talk about that in just, I can talk about that in just a moment. Let me share this video with you. There we go. Okay. So that melody probably is also familiar to many of you, as it's a melody we've used also at Temple Isaiah for Oseh Shalom. And though that is sort of an atypical representation of their prayer, I wanted to give you at least a sample of their music. As I say, normally they're praying in circles, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Nava Tehillah, the name Nava Tehillah means beautiful praise. You may recognize the word Tehillah is similar to the word Tehillim. Tehillim are the Psalms, songs of praise. From their beginning, they were created really initially as a community where people from different faiths would feel comfortable in praying as a part of the Jewish community. In fact, their first name, before they were called Nava Tehillah, they were called Kabbalat Shabbat for all nations. Kabbalat Shabbat for all nations. So interesting. And it still continues to be that way. One example is that there's actually a Catholic Beatitude seminary in Jerusalem that prays with them every single Shabbat for Kabbalat Shabbat. So still has become a venue for people of all backgrounds. Ruth Kagan, the rabbi, she first created this service in 2005. And over the next year, she invited Daphna and Yoel to join in leading and creating music for the service. All of the music they use is original and was written for them. So they don't use other people's music, they only use their own music. It was the first spiritual community in Israel to pray, as you saw, in concentric circles, and included much repetitive chanting as a major part of the prayer experience. The style that they use, or the method, or they call it the shita that they use, is to take one melody and sing it for a long time. Usually, I don't know where they came up with this number, I'd have to find out, but for at least 9 minutes. So every piece that they do is drawn out, it is long. And we experienced that when they sang with us as well. They do not use amplification, as they don't feel the need for certain voices to sound louder than everyone else's voices. So they usually have a large group of prayer leaders. That entire inner circle, not just the 3 of them, are all people who have practiced and prepared to lead worship. They call them the Levites. As you may know from your biblical history, that Levites were the musicians of the congregation, the ones who led music in the temple. And so they call them the Levites. By having that many people all be the leaders, it really helps engage everyone in music without using amplification, a very intentional thing. They feel it allows everyone's voice to feel just as strong and just as much a part of what's happening. To tell you a little bit about their backgrounds, Ruth, the rabbi, grew up Orthodox. She grew up in an Orthodox community, but one in which there was a great deal of singing. Singing was an instructional methodology in school. Everything was taught through song. And at home, she recollects singing Zmirot, that is to say Shabbos table songs around the Shabbat table. She saw many times, both her father and grandfather were worship leaders. And the combination of these things and her own musical gifts were really what modeled a foundation for her. When she was 28 years old, she spent time in the United States, and she participated in a minyan in Boston called Minyan Shalem, and that was her first introduction into leading worship. You can imagine, as a woman growing up in an Orthodox community, that was a new opportunity, a new experience for her. But she did not have any formal musical training. And the same is true of Daphna, who's one of the main composers. She studied a little bit of piano as a child, and Jewish music was not any part of her childhood, but she was raised around a lot of classical music and jazz, and those both have influenced her compositional style. Yoel is the one who has the formal musical training, and interestingly, he studied music at the Center for Eastern Music in Jerusalem. So again, studying more traditional sounds, as well as studying flamenco guitar in Spain. He is a trained flamenco guitarist. And I think if I had left that video on, you would have heard some of his amazing guitar playing as well. So he really was exposed to a lot of different styles growing up, especially at his study at the Center for Eastern Music, which is studying music of the entire Middle and Far East. Andy, I think, had asked about Shlomo Carlebach, and Shlomo Carlebach was a major influence for Ruth. Some of you may know who Shlomo Carlebach was, a rabbi and leader and musician himself. So Ruth had met Shlomo Carlebach through some interfaith activities that she was involved in, and feels that he really introduced her to the transformative power of music and worship. And when you think about the style that Shlomo Carlebach writes, very repetitive melodies and folk melodies, it doesn't surprise me that they stick with these melodies for 9 or 10 minutes until it really gets in you. A very different style than what we are used to. Also, Sister Ruth Heflin, who's a Baptist minister in East Jerusalem, was another major influence on Ruth. Ruth attended their worship services and saw Sister Ruth involved in praise and worship. She was profoundly touched by this experience. And so she sees her, and seeing a woman leading prayer was also a great influence. She saw her as a real prophet. Nava Tehila's contribution is not only, as I say, the music, but also the style in which they perform. Let's listen to one other example of their music. This is a setting of a Lachadodi from their community as well. One moment.
לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד, השמיענו אל המיוחד. אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשם ותפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי מקור הברכה מראש מקדם נסוכה, סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה.
So some of you were saying, just in the chat, very accessible, very easy to access music. Raul, did you want to share something?
No,
It sounds like almost Latin influence.
Latin music.
Latin.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that in the rhythm and the accompaniment. Absolutely. You know, I especially think in Yoel's music, I think he's so well trained in a lot of world music, and we're going to transition to world music in just a second, that you hear a lot of that flavor. I think what's particularly interesting when you think of a group like Nava Tehila, again, who writes all their own music. So, you know, you can imagine, you know, a demand that's put on them is that they're creating all of the music for all of their worship all of the time. And I think, you know, I think sometimes changes in Jewish music happen because of musical necessity, because of what the musical needs are. And at times I think they change because of spiritual necessity. And I think what's particularly interesting in looking at Gerald Cohen, who writes commissions of music, who people want certain things, certain sounds. I want a piece for Cantor and choir. I want a piece for Cantor and this, where there's really musical demands being put on. And we look at a community like Nava Tehillah, who's really relying on spiritual connections. They write about their impact on liturgy. They say that what is unique about what they do compared to, I would say, a lot of other religious experiences in Israel is that it is God-oriented, focused more on kavanah, that is to say, intention, than keva, what is prescribed. Because liberal Judaism is not one that is widely spread in Israel, so much of worship, if you are praying in Israel, is focused on keva. That is to say, here is the liturgy, here is the litany of prayers that must be prayed, and they are prayed through in such a way. What they do, as I say, is God-oriented. Their goal, they say, is to give worshipers permission to have a personal connection to God and pray. Daphna notes they push a lot of focus on a personal prayer experience within the midst of a larger community. And even in the video that I shared, you could see people having very personal and spiritual, almost one could say, in the Jewish world, I guess you could still say, an ecstatic Jewish prayer experience. Through the incorporation of chanting and kavanot, they strive to create what they call a neo-Hasidic ecstatic prayer experience. And so there, it seems that coming from one's own sense of spirituality, then comes the desire to create new music, to create new access to worship. So a very different approach to art music that we started with Gerald Cohen, whereas he is taking the roots of classical music and bringing it to a different level through Judaism. Oh, that's great, Roy. Roy wrote in the chat that he had a chance to be in the Levite Circle via Zoom a few months ago, and it was fabulous. That's great. So that's so interesting, Pam. I love that. So Pam wrote, how can they write all their own music when you have played two very traditional pieces that I would assume are very older? But they're not. Those are original pieces that they wrote. So it's so interesting. It's so interesting what we hear, right? And that's part of what we bring also to the experience, right? As listeners, as participants. You know, Charlotte and Raul heard Latin sounds. Pam, you heard things that sounded like, that must be very traditional Jewish music, right? It has a certain flavor to it that gives us that. But this is all original music that's been written over the last 10 to 15 years. So, so interesting what we each bring to this experience. So the third case study, the third example we're going to look at today, give me just 1 second to get my papers in order here, is the music of Basia Schechter. And let me share just so that you have a little bit of a visual there. Okay. So, oops. Give me a second, I'm sorry. Okay. Let me try that again. I know what I did wrong. Okay. Are you all seeing what is world music? Great. Okay, thank you. Again, I appreciate your patience. So our last case study looks at the music of Basia Schechter, whose exploration of Jewishness through music is not dissimilar from what we just saw with Gerald Cohen and Nava Tehillah. Like Gerald, Basia creates complex music that explores Jewish themes and texts, but her music is really filtered through the lens of world music that is going to be similar to what some of you heard in the music of Nava Tehillah. Basia embraces the concept of universalism and the ideas also behind renewal Judaism with a root in traditional Judaism. So just to talk here about world music, what is world music? Maybe you've heard this term before. And you'll see there's a picture here of an oud. That is the instrument that you see in front of you, and we'll hear a little bit of oud later. So this term, world music, was actually created in the commercial music world. It was really a term of convenience, and it was a category developed in the 1980s to sell music and to sell records that didn't fit into the traditional category of Western music or music with European roots. So they decided to call this world music. That is to say, kind of anything that didn't fall into what you might be used to hearing in North America, either in the concert hall or on the radio. Today, we're much more specific about styles. We cite, examples of where music comes from. But so world music in some ways can mean just about anything that doesn't fit into that traditional Western music category. But hopefully we can always be very specific. We might talk about, for instance, Argentinian tango music or something like that. And this terminology is in no way meant to suggest that world music is one style or comes from one place, but it is a term that is used. Here's an example of the way world music really found its way in the 80s into popular music. Some of you may know this Paul Simon song, Diamond on the Soles of Her Shoes. And let me share an example of that. You'll just be hearing this. Sorry, I have to let a short 15-second ad play on YouTube before I can play you this example. But I'm not going to play the ad for you. Okay, now we can hear the music.
She's a rich girl, she don't try to hide it. Diamonds on the soles of her shoes. He's a poor boy, empty as a pocket with nothing to lose. Sing ta-na-na, ta-na-na-na. She got diamonds on the soles of her shoes. Ta-na-na, ta-na-na-na. She got diamonds on the soles of her shoes. 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 People say she's crazy, she got diamonds on the soles of her shoes.
So again, just a little bit of a sample of what world music sounded like and how it sort of made its way into more popular music. So Basia Schechter, she describes it as blending psychedelic sensibility and pan-Mediterranean sensuality. Those are her words. I'll say that again so you can really digest it. Psychedelic sensibility and pan-Mediterranean sensuality. She leads a band called Pharaoh's Daughter. Some of you may know the name Basia is the name that rabbinic texts actually assign to the daughter of Pharaoh in the Bible. She doesn't have a name in the Bible, but in Midrash, we learn the name Basia. So that was her own name, and she took on the name of her band, Pharaoh's Daughter, from that. She combines Hasidic chanting, Mizrahi, and Sephardic folk rock, and spiritual stylings filtered through percussion, flute, strings, and electronic sounds. She has a Hasidic a Hasidic background, and you'll hear that some of that influences her writing, as well as much travel and musical study through the Middle East, Africa, Israel, Egypt, Central Africa, Kurdistan, and Greece. Let's listen to a little bit of music of Basia Schechter. That's an oud, by the way.
Avraham, Avraham, al tishlach yadcha el hanahar v'al taslo me'uma. Avraham, Avraham, al tishlach yadcha el hanahar v'al taslo me'uma. Lo todi'atini כשהיא עומדת על הבור, לא תודיעתיני כשהיא עומדת על הגג. שמא תפיל את עצמה ותעמוד.
So you hear a lot of interesting things that we're hearing. A lot of influence instrumentally from instruments of the Middle East. I think the harmonies also resemble a lot of singing in Africa. She's very interested in harmony, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But let's talk a little bit about her background. I'm gonna stop my share for right now. So she grew up in Borough Park, and maybe that's, for some people, says enough. If you know, when I say Borough Park, it gives you an idea of the Jewish flavor. She grew up in a Hasidic community, in an Orthodox community. And she says, music was part of the air I breathed. I was learning music from day one. At every simcha, there were bands, klezmer bands. At bar mitzvahs and weddings, we always had Jewish music there. She says, at recess, we would just sing Jewish songs together. The girls, of course, separated. The girls sang in a Jewish choir at school, and we would sing harmonies together. We got together on Shabbat to sing. We got together to do zmiros, traditional Shabbat songs. And everything we learned Torah-wise was set to melodies. So we learned Torah through song. We learned Torah through chanting. We memorized Hebrew grammar, she said, with melodies. So every part of her Jewish upbringing and her Jewish education was paired with music. While she had no formal musical training, Basia notes she was pretty quickly indoctrinated into the harmonic landscape of finding harmony, a third above, a fifth above, a third below, finding counter melodies. So singing in this chorus and hearing this Jewish music was something that she picked up on very quickly. She says, I love singing harmony. As soon as my father would sing, I would try to find harmony above it or below it. I think part of it is finding your voice within a multitude of voices. And I would say people who sing in a choir would say very much that same thing. I think it's about finding the creative kind of musical line that's very much your own. Now, again, her whole exposure to music until she was in high school was Jewish music. It was what she heard in Borough Park. And she writes that in 10th grade, she says she, quote, tricked her father into sending her on a co-ed Orthodox tour in Israel. She says the biggest thing that she got out of that is that everyone else was listening to English contemporary American rock music. So the biggest thing she got, she says, from that trip was exposure to music she had never heard before. Music like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and The Doors. And she soon taught herself guitar and began writing her own songs. She spent her junior year abroad in South Africa and was exposed to a lot of African influences, Mozambican influences, Zimbabwe influences. She was exposed to all sorts of kind of music that combined cultural influences with jazz. And she suddenly saw the idea of fusion, taking the sounds of her Hasidic youth and combining it with some of the modern rock sounds she heard. All throughout college, she hitchhiked around Africa and South America. She spent a lot of time in the Middle East, as she says, soaking up these cultures, and had been writing a lot of music. But up until this point, her music had been written completely in English. She said, but then some of the melodies I was writing didn't work out with English lyrics so well. She said, every time I'd sing English lyrics to a melody I was writing, I felt it sounded corny. And so I turned back to my Hebrew roots. Because I grew up in a Torah environment where we had to memorize Pesukim, verses from the prophets in Torah and Tefillah, she had so much text memorized already. So she had all these new melodies where she didn't like the English words and all these Hebrew texts that she had memorized as a child. And she started putting them together. And that really created a lot of her sounds. In particular, she says she points to the music of Mali as an important musical influence on her. So African music, Mali in West Africa. Malian music is very emotional. The melodies are cyclical versus linear. She says, I think Western music is very linear, where Malian music creates patterns that build one on top of another. She has subsequently started doing a lot of collaboration with other artists, and I'm going to share a little bit of that with you now. This is a collaboration with a Jewish rapper. His name is Eden Perlstein. He goes by the name Ephraim, that is to say, not Ephraim, but Ephraim. Very clever use of combining those things together. So I am going to share my screen. This, you should be able to see the video as well, as I want you to be able to see the words. We'll listen to this setting of Raza de Shabbat. Some of you may know this piyut. Raza de Shabbat is a Kabbalistic prayer that talks about uniting HaKodesh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, God, with the Shekhinah. It's talking about the secret of Shabbat, that the feminine side of God is the Sabbath. It is a feminine celebration of the secret of Shabbat and the unification. It's the moment that brings us to Baruch Hu. So usually this is done right before Baruch Hu, our call to worship. It doesn't appear in every Siddur. The text comes from the Zohar, that is to say the main source of Kabbalistic teaching. So I'm going to share with you this collaboration she did on Raza de Shabbat with the rapper Ephraim.
כי גהבנה תינו נסייחדין לילה ויחד יחדת לטאטה ירזה Raza
history, divine mathematics. 1 + 1 = 1, can't grasp it. Unity, overcome false dichotomy, used to confuse the human community. So we forget about our root in the celestial, but remember truth bears fruit in the terrestrial. Spread these songs like audio, apple seeds. Every 7 days create another new master. Arrives in time to rhyme, all dressed in red like a glass of wine. Put the crown of a mind at the top of your spine and let the light shine on the thread is white. For 6 days the pain of pain, and she became what we created. On this day the secret stated, all for the sake of unification.
Something a little different for you. I have not spent the pandemic brushing up my rap skills, so you probably won't hear me do that particular setting on Shabbat anytime soon. But this is actually part of a larger project called Darshan, and if you want to check it out, you can certainly Google that, Darshan, D-A-R-S-H-A-N, which is a music project inspired by mystical poetry and combines a lot of different media, musical midrash, rap commentary. But I think it's amazing to hear what she's doing. When it starts, again, it has, I think, a very exotic sound to it. Her choice of instrumentation, her style of singing, her style of music, and then pairing it with Ephraim and his own rap and his interpretation, referencing the Sabbath bride and all that is happening on Shabbat, I find just really, really fascinating. Something interesting about Basia is that she went on to become ordained as a cantor, even though you might not imagine that necessarily from her style. And she serves a community in New York called Romamu. I don't know if any of you have ever visited, but if you're ever in New York City, when we're all traveling and praying again together as communities, I highly recommend checking out Romamu. It's an amazing community on the Upper West Side, and she has a large band of musicians and does some amazing, amazing stuff. Check them out on Shabbat sometime. But she, again, went on to become ordained as a cantor, and so she is bringing a lot of her style to synagogue music. Again, bringing the sounds of world music and collaboration as well. Let me just share, because I like this quote. Oops. Okay. What she says here on the screen, she says, I traveled all through Africa by myself. I spent time in a cultural center in Harare, and I studied a little marimba there by ear, nothing formal. It was a place that people told me there Paul Simon had gone to. So I ran into places that Paul Simon had also been to, looking for new influences. And I think that's where I figured out I could write my own music that was already inspired by Jewish music, but by my Jewish heritage and sort of the classic rock that I was growing up with in late high school, college, and singer-songwriter. And then also using cultural influences from other cultures like Africa. That's where it began. And it's so interesting to think about sort of these influences, because of course, throughout time and throughout Jewish music, no matter what period, we are always influenced by the sounds around us, whether it was the early reformers who were emulating their Protestant neighbors, whether it was even much of Israeli music, traditional Israeli music, which is also influenced much by Arabic music, which is around them, or the music that Basia Schechter is writing, which is so influenced by the sounds of music she heard as a young person, the sounds of classic rock, combined with much of the music throughout her travels that she has picked up around the Middle East and Africa. We see, again, so much of that influence in her music, and what we see in so much of new Jewish music. So exploring today these ideas of art music, spiritual renewal music, and world music. I hope this gave you, again, a new sampling of what's happening in the world of Jewish music today. In particular, things to consider, what really they had in common, each of them taking things that were very deeply rooted in them in their own childhood, in their own musical training, as well as their Jewish training, and finding a way of merging those worlds together, whether it was Gerald Cohen's study of classical music that he could then combine with his strong roots of Jewish education as a young person, whether it was looking at Nava Tehillah, who really sought to bring some of that Hasidic feel into an egalitarian setting, as well as Basia Schechter, who brought the sounds of world music now into the synagogue. I love that, Terry. Not feeling restricted to one form of musical expression. This is who we are as Jews, right? There's music we sing on Shabbat that has that Hasidic feel, and there's also music that we sing on Shabbat that has a very contemporary feel. You're stuck with a Cantor with roots and deep love of musical theater, and I think probably you'll even hear that in some of my choices and what I bring to worship. And so these were just looking at three very different sounds, the sounds that we're not necessarily used to hearing at Temple Isaiah. And so again, I think thinking about how the trends we looked at in the first session really influenced even these composers, I hope gave you a new flavor. Our last class is going to be next Sunday, and we're going to actually go in a totally different direction, which is we're going to move from the synagogue to the concert hall. And Marian had even referenced the music of Leonard Bernstein. And next week, we're going to look at the music of Leonard Bernstein, as well as the music of Ernest Bloch. Ernest Bloch, one of the amazing composers of the concert stage, who brings in his own Jewish identity into his music, specifically looking at Leonard Bernstein and looking at how his Jewish upbringing and Jewish identity influenced much of his compositional style and writing. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It was great to see everybody, and I hope you will join us next week. Next week, by the way, on Sunday night, we also will be observing Shavuot. So please watch your email for information about our program that we'll be having both in person on Zoom on Sunday night, as well as Monday morning. As we normally do for our festival services, we will have Shavuot morning service with Yizkor on Monday morning. That is a week from Monday, not this Monday. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Cantor.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cantor.
This was a fab Mother's Day gift.
Oh, good. Happy Mother's Day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Mother's
Thank you.
Happy Mother's Day.
For those observing, happy Mother's Day.
Thank you.
This was so interesting. Fantastic.
Hey, you still gotta call me.
Thank you, Cantor.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great week. Shavua Tov. We'll see you next week.
We all live on Mother Earth.
Indeed, indeed.
Yes, yes.